Hello, I'm Michael Harris, RegTech advisor and specialist in financial crime risk management. Financial crime compliance and KYC in particular is at a crossroads. And over the last decade, increasing anti-money laundering regulation, pressure from the regulator, has led to many firms investing more and more in KYC and AML compliance. And research shows that the overall cost of compliance has risen disproportionately over the last decade and is probably now at unsustainable levels. So digital transformation of KYC is a theme we're hearing more and more about. And in this conversation, we're going to explore some of the factors that are driving this and the challenges that the regulated sectors face. We'll also attempt to provide some guidance for firms starting on the digital journey, as all of this is having a significant effect on competitiveness and efficiency. I'm in conversation with Matt Neill and Catto, both of Beyond, a specialist firm who work with financial service organizations to help them design and deliver digital transformations within client onboarding, financial crime, compliance, and operational areas. Thank you for joining me. Let's start by asking each of you to comment in more detail on the trends that are impacting the KYC world for organizations and the impact this is having. And perhaps you could talk about some of the external trends and some of the internal factors and challenges that are facing organizations and impacting them. So Matt, if I could start with you, perhaps you could talk us through some of the external trends in particular that you're seeing that firms are having to deal with.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Mike, and thank you for having us. I guess from a context point of view, we work with banks, asset managers, fintechs, and industry players and vendors as well. So we've got a sort of broad spectrum of experience, and I think there's probably a few external trends we can probably highlight that we see kind of consistent across all those areas. I think the first one is probably sort of the complexity of the regulatory environment. It kind of probably goes without saying, but it's changed rapidly over the last 10 to 15 years, and really regular changes to KYC and AML, but also tax regulations and other regulations covering some of the more complex kind of financial instruments like derivatives and such. So we know that the scope of the regulations has massively increased the requirements on financial institutions, while also sort of some of the national and regional differences have really made that a really complex area in terms of managing those regulations. I think going on to sort of maybe a second point is really around changing customer expectations, and I think that's a huge trend we've seen, especially over the last 10 years, in terms of expectations around how consumers expect to interact with organizations, and particularly financial services is no different. So we saw that with, we've seen that sort of almost the bar being set by the neobanks and some of the fintechs. And customers really now expect that seamless digital experience and very good customer service. And that translates to all areas of our lives today, right? So, they don't want to be taking digital experiences and then also getting pushed into sort of non-digital kind of flows as well. So you don't want to be doing a digital experience and then be forced to print something off or scan something in, for instance. So I think expectations have definitely gone up, and probably financial services have been a little bit slow to react in general. Maybe the third external trend we've seen is really, and maybe this talks to more sort of the compliance area and financial crime compliance, but the changing role of the compliance officer and analyst as well, but really how the shift towards data and technology has massively changed that role. I think 10, 15 years ago, that function really didn't have to be that close to technology or the data, but now it's almost become a primary part of those worlds. So I think the people in those functions have had to really adapt and also start to drive the change themselves, which is a new area. So I think that changing role is probably the third thing I'd highlight.
Thank you, Matt.
Sure.
So yes, in summary, firms are having to deal with an awful lot of external factors that have changed. And obviously with that, Al, bring a lot of internal challenges. And from your perspective, what kind of challenges are firms having to deal with in dealing with all these, factors that Matt's talked about?
I think it's a very, very good question, Mike. Yeah, I think there are a number of challenges. One of the first that I would probably point out is that there is just a generally a very complex delivery agenda that needs to be managed by most of these organizations. That can be very challenging and very wide ranging. So there's a real need to focus on a strategic roadmap to ensure that all efforts and initiatives are supporting the goals of the organization. And you really need to understand what those goals are. And that's usually best sort of expressed by looking at the kind of drivers for change which are actually happening. And they can be unique to an organization, often unique at a point in time as well. And they tend to be across compliance, customer experience, and efficiency. And it's those three levers, the balance of those three, which need to be considered. I think that's probably one of the kind of most holistic kind of drivers or considerations that need to be taken into account. Then you have the fact that organizations really need to build up their project teams on a holistic basis. The big change in terms of technology, the changing role of the compliance officer that Matt mentions, really means that cross-functional teams need to be formed with the right skills and right capabilities to deliver against these complex goals. And that results in an ever-increasing amount of stakeholder engagement that's needed across organizations. And that's sort of an internal challenge, but is also seen externally as well in terms of engaging regulators and other third parties, such as vendors, in terms of delivering successfully. And I think the final point I'd make from an internal perspective is that there's a major challenge in terms of the approach taken. There's a need to think about this as an implementation journey. So complex changes need to be broken down and taken step by step. So it's really critically important for organizations to appreciate that taking these incremental small steps in the right direction to deliver benefit and increasing confidence in the ability of an organization to deliver a change successfully over time and actually manifest tangible benefits within the organization is the way to go, rather than trying to deliver kind of at a bigger scale in a big bang manner.
Yeah, absolutely. So we talk a lot about how, and sadly we can never get very far from the subject of the pandemic, but we talk a lot about how that has accelerated a lot of digital transformation, and obviously things like remote working in particular, force this upon a lot of firms to quickly develop identity management solutions, for example, that enable them to continue to function remotely. If we can get a little bit into the nitty-gritty of operations, KYC operations, what other areas are you seeing that you would say firms are having to deal with from a technology perspective, from a data perspective, and what process, what digital transformation, what changes are happening to bring this about? Not necessarily just in relation to the pandemic, but more broadly. Let's look at the details of what sort of systems and data challenges firms have. So perhaps Matt, you take that one and start with.
Sure, yeah. So I think I guess there were some changes which were happening anyway, and to some extent you could argue whether that has been sped up by the pandemic or not, and there have been some trends in terms of some of the technologies and maybe availability of data, which we can get into a little bit. I think the impact of the pandemic has been obviously, clearly what it's done is remove the physical contact between organizations and customers in terms of that ability to meet face to face, and as well, I guess crucially the internal teams as well. So you've got the sort of the customer digital facing part of this, and then you've got the internal ways of digital kind of ways of working or workflows or the way of managing things. So I think there's probably a couple of things which have definitely accelerated through the pandemic. If you look at those, what it's done, it's think about digital onboarding, and I think if organizations weren't already looking at that as a key thing, then they certainly are now, because I think everyone's realised that if this was they felt like it was a nice to have or could be done in a few more years' time. Actually, that's not the case today, and they're losing out if they haven't got those kind of that functionality in place. So I think when we talk about digital onboarding, we're talking about the customer portals, thinking about that whole front end of that process. So digital IDMV, which you mentioned, the customer portals where you can exchange, provide your information and work through the onboarding flow. That's got to be enabled also, of course, by a whole plethora of things behind the scenes, such as, rules and data and checks that are enabled there as well. So there's a lot which goes into that. I think the other thing there, as we touched on, is the I guess the middle office and back office processes, which sort of now more than ever need to be digitized. So you can't just walk across to your mate across the office and sort of say, oh, can you pick this up now? That thing as much as possible needs to be controlled through digital flows and things like case management systems, CLM systems. If organizations weren't already doing those, using those types of technology, looking at them, they certainly will have done over the last 18 months to 2 years, I think. Maybe one of bit of left field one is the sort of, from a compliance perspective, is the communication surveillance, which I know, speaking to a lot of organizations lately, that's something that they're now having to look at more carefully. Of people are at home, what other controls around communications do we need? So yeah, plenty of change.
Plenty of change, absolutely. Al, anything you'd like to add to that? And particularly, I'd just like to get your thoughts on the way that firms, or what expectations firms have to facilitate the transfer of data, both internally and externally. We see, an awful lot of comment about API technology and SaaS and all these buzzwords. But what are you seeing, that are the enablers of this technology journey for firms and data sharing?
There's an awful lot in that question, Mike. That's a really, really good point, though. I think one of a trend that is being driven by the pandemic specifically is this move towards greater automation of flows and the automation of data. There's a desire not to reach out to the clients all the time and ask for documents and data to be provided. We want to utilize public data sources. So that results in a need for data provision and hooking yourself up to a number of different solutions providers who are able to provide that in different jurisdictions, so that you can pull in as much information that's available publicly as possible. Now that's great if you can do it. One of the challenges with that is the overall cost. It can be very costly to bring in all that information, and I know that in certain cases, especially from more esoteric data or jurisdictions which are less well served, there's little competition, so it can be very costly to bring in information through those kind of flows. There is a critical element that needs to be enabled within organizations as well to make that possible, and it's something that I think the industry's been dealing with for some time. It's been a challenge, which is the single view of the client. It's all very well pulling in information in an automated fashion, but it needs to land in the right place. And that needs to happen across business lines as well. So if you're onboarding for multiple business lines, or indeed expanding relationships across multiple business lines, you need to have the confidence that when that information is brought in, all your entity resolution has been done, and that information is going to land on the right profile. So you're keeping everything up to date. That's just one part of it. Ultimately, this is a significant data challenge. If you're pulling in information from multiple sources, you need to be able to cross-check them. You need to be able to get comfortable with the data that's coming in and make decisions if you've got any clashes between that data. So if you've got anything that looks out of sync, you should be able to highlight that and potentially bring your team in as well to be able to manage that. And I think that is been massively accelerated by the pandemic. There's probably a couple of other trends which have been accelerated. I think that were happening anyway. I think they've been pushed a bit further by the pandemic. One of those is the idea of utilizing omni-channels when you're looking at a digital flow. So I think users now, the expectation is that your customer will be able to engage through any channel they wish at any time. So they can start a process utilizing an online portal, then they might make a phone call, then they might send in a document, they might want to actually visit a physical location, perhaps even. And all those things need to be catered for. It mustn't feel genuinely seamless from the customer's point of view. That's a very hard thing to achieve. And I think especially when you start looking into a more corporate world rather than retail banking, where obviously KYC and AML requirements are relatively straightforward. And I think it's really important to get this right. So just a interesting fact, there was a survey that I was actually reading recently. They surveyed about 250 individual banks. 34% of those stated that they'd lost a client due to a poor onboarding experience. And 84% of the 250 that were surveyed said that they genuinely felt that a poor onboarding experience had impacted the lifetime value of the client. So either the client not coming back or not wanting to extend business with that particular organization. So it's really important to get these things right.
Well, that's an interesting point and a great segue into what I wanted to ask you both about next, which is really, you see this all the time working with clients who are at various stages on this journey. It can seem overwhelming when you start out. And for many firms, they are starting out on this digital transformation journey. So from your respective experiences, what would your advice be to firms that have yet to get on the digital journey? How should they start? And importantly, what would be the benefits that they could see? I think you've touched on an awful lot of this already, but the main benefits that should provide them with an incentive to get started. So Al, can I fire that one at you to start with?
Yeah, of course. I think that there's a very simple answer to that, which is there is no time like the present. I think it is really important to get started on this journey as quickly as possible. Digital journeys are becoming commonplace across industries. Financial services, the neobanks have really pushed this with the retail side. It's going to become expected within the corporate world very soon. You know, the directors of companies are having this very much slicker experience when they're opening their own bank account. So we can expect this to be a demand going forward. In terms of how to get started and the benefits, well, the benefits really are split across the three levers that I mentioned. So efficiency, compliance, and customer experience. And then there's multiple things that come within each of those levers. And you'd be seeking as an organization, you want to make sure that your compliance process is comprehensive, so that you can be comfortable that at any point in time you're able to demonstrate compliance of your complete population, which is something that I think it would be true to say most organizations really struggle with now. That request results in a lot of manual work. It should be possible to manage that completely digitally and come back with an answer if you do this correctly. Small steps, but that is an ultimate outcome. Customer experience, it should be possible to engage your entire customer base much more easily. If you provide them with portals, they can provide documents and data straight through the portal. There's no need to do reach out. And in terms of efficiency, we're looking at automation in the back end. So it should be a question of being able to basically ensure your teams are really optimized. They're focused on the right things. There are certain, everyone's very excited about AI and deep learning, etc. That's great, but there are certain things that people do much better today. We need to make sure those people are focused on the right things. But simple tasks, which can be automated through technology, it should be possible to identify them and take them out of the process. I think in terms of getting started, again, I mentioned before, thinking holistically, the onboarding world, and this challenge in particular, is a great example of where people, process, technology, and we always add policy and data are really, really important. You need to think about all of those in the context of onboarding. And we find that generally the best place to start is policy. And the main reason for that is it can be a relatively desk-based exercise to work through the policy and demonstrate whether it's optimized, whether there's any additional items being asked for or questions that could be taken out. It's a relatively straightforward exercise before you ever reach for technology, so it's relatively low cost. And if you understand your policy really well and how that should be applied, then it's a lot easier to look at process and technology, and you can get your people focused much better. There's often a really good place to start if you're looking for a sort of a jumping off point.
Thank you, Al. Matt, if I could just ask you to comment as firms consider going on this journey, the importance of, let me call it teamwork, but not just teamwork internally, but also externally, and bringing together a strategic alliance of, let's say, partnerships, how important that is, and the work that you do, particularly with the FinTech Innovation Network, in creating a community where there is a technology pool that firms can actually access.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's a critical point in, I guess, following on a little bit from what Al was saying there, which is, look, digital transformation is also not just about the technology here, or it's not all about the technology. This is about organizational change, sort of almost enabled by technology, right? So I think when you asked Al, like, the question around when should people start and how do they get going, well, I think often organizations look at what kind of the visionary state is on a lot of this stuff, and it looks so far away that this is really about a journey, and some of the steps you need to take on that are quite sort of non-digital. So some of the foundational steps Al was speaking about, which is, getting your policy right, getting your process right, these things all need to happen before you can then bring in the technology. And I think that the points you're making there about, looking how you partner with the industry, that's absolutely critical in terms of understanding what solutions are out there now, and how they can enable you to genuinely digitize processes, but also transform your business. So there's kind of two elements of digitization, really, which is one, which is, you're digitizing your current process, which is where I think a lot of, it's often the first step, but often maybe not quite the right step, depending on the circumstance, because really what you want to look at doing is how can we transform this process using the new technology that's available to us. So by partnering up, I think, with the industry and understanding how your whole solution needs to look and what your target operating model needs to be, can really give you that view across the different systems that need to come together here to really create a effective solution. So I think partnerships absolutely critical, both, I think with potentially consultancies, managed service providers, technology providers, as well as internal teams and partnerships within the business, so I think partnerships is absolutely critical to getting any kind of transformation done.
Yeah, thank you, Matt. I couldn't agree more. I think at the end of the day, firms need as much help and resource to address these challenges as possible. And you certainly can't do all this on your own. The very bigger organizations have lots of advantages because they have a breadth of resources. But for the smaller organizations and some of the customers, the people that we talk to, you can see that help is needed. So finally, I'd just like to perhaps, we're recording this in December, a short time to Christmas. And we're all looking forward to a break, that's for sure. But it's a great time also just to get the crystal ball out and just have a little think about what might be impacting the KYC world in 2022. So perhaps, again, Matt, if I can start with you, your projections for next year.
Oh, it's always fun getting the crystal ball out. So I think, we do hear a lot about in the industry about sort of the current or the future trends and maybe new technologies and things like machine learning, AI, etc. But I actually think probably what we're going to see most of, or maybe a big trend in 2022, will actually be firms looking at, or maybe re-looking is the right way to say, at the sort of current operating or current operating model, and looking at what their target operating model for KYC should be. So my feeling is, talking to a lot of organizations over the last few years, they have made big investments in this space, whether that's in systems or outsourcing arrangements, and maybe some of those investments haven't paid off as they thought. Maybe the efficiency wasn't really gained from that implementation, or the savings that they were hoping to make haven't really transpired. Maybe the quality of KYC has gone down, in fact. So I think a lot of organizations are going to be taking stock of where they are today and actually where they need to get to in 3 to 5 years, and actually looking at that operating model as, okay, look, how do we maybe utilize some of these newer technologies? What are the models that we should be using to make this process, as we kind of talked about from the driver's perspective, more customer friendly, more efficient, more effective from a risk perspective and compliance perspective as well. So my feeling is that actually a lot of organizations, that's where they are.
Yeah, thank you. And Al, the final word to you in terms of how you see 2022.
It's an interesting. It could be a very, very interesting year. I mean, there are a couple of topics which have been discussed, heatedly over the last couple of years, which I think are starting to come to fruition. So things like perpetual KYC, I imagine that's still going to be a major topic, and all of the constituent parts. And I think the people that are furthest along that journey at the moment, and there are some organisations which are making inroads, are starting to get their data in great shape. It's getting that single view of the customer, doing the entity resolution, making sure that it's very clear how the flows will work, and engaging that with their workflow. So I think we're going to see some movement on in that space. I think that also talks to another major element that I'm really hoping that the industry starts to get its head round, which is the data that client onboarding actually gathers. There's a real sort of, I guess there's a view that this is sort of essential data that is just pulled up at the point of onboarding and then it's held within the organization. But in actual fact, this is the point at which the bank's data model meets the customer. And if the client onboarding function does its job correctly and fills that data out in the right way, in the most efficient fashion, firstly, it should save time in the short run in terms of onboarding. If that data is correct and represented the right way, it should actually be a gift that just keeps on giving, because over time, as you're doing periodic reviews, it should be easy to maintain that data and update it. And then the third key element, which I'm not sure that people have really thought about enough up to this point, is the value of that data. We always talk about know your client in terms of the compliance angle, but there is a genuine benefit to knowing your client really well and what's going on with your client, how they're behaving, how things are changing. And if that can be fed back to the front office in the right way, that potentially could drive some significant benefit from their point of view, knowing when to interact with clients, knowing how things are changing, and being able to come with potential advice and products at the right time. So that's something I'd really like to see happening in 2022. So I guess something for people to consider.
Absolutely. Your wish list is clear, Al. Thank you. And thanks to both of you for all of your insights and the thoughts that you put across during this conversation, which obviously we hope are of interest to our listeners. There's a lot to be done, and for sure, firms are on a journey, as we've talked about continuously, and it's really a never-ending journey. Regulation, financial crime are all continuously changing scenarios, and for that reason, I think the overarching message for me that I take from this is that we have the technology, we have the ability, we have the capability to do all of these things, but firms will need to have that appetite to get on the journey, to make a start if they haven't already, but to be continuously investing in their KYC, their AML processes, but ultimately with a viewpoint of making them more efficient, more effective, and hopefully more robust to actually fight financial crime, which ultimately is what we're all about in doing the jobs that we do. Thank you both. Thank you for listening. And if you'd like to continue this conversation, we welcome that opportunity. So please do drop us a line or get in touch, and the details will be on the screen at the end of this discussion. And thank you and goodbye.
Thanks very much, Mike.